Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is one of the seminar organized by the Perseo ATN Marie Curie training network. And we have today Patrick Holthaus, which is a colleague and a dear friend of us, particularly mine. And Patrick is a senior research fellow in the robotics research group at the University of Hertfordshire, and he also the manager of Holthaus. For those who don't know Holthaus, what it is a quite unique facility who has basically has a resemblance of British House. It's a British house which is equipped with a lot of sensor and robots to allow human-robot interactions, studies in human-robot interaction in a very real environment. Patrick also got his PhD in 2015 on integrated concept of spatial awareness at the Bielefeld University. And is very active in the scientific community of HRI, as many of you have met him in a conference, workshop as an organizer, and also as organizer of special session, a special issue. I know Patrick also prepared a bit of presentation, a bit more detailed than I just gave, so I will leave the floor to Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandra. That was a nice introduction. Very grateful. My own introduction is a bit towards this presentation, because today we talk about academic peer review process and best practices in that. So as Alessandra said, I'm from the University of Hertfordshire, and I want to talk to you first a little bit about myself and my role in peer review process, and also then introduce the process itself. How does peer review work and why do we do it? Then talk about some best practices and guidelines, and in the end, some discussion and questions. And I hope that you have plenty of questions for me that I can have you maybe answer. Maybe we can do that together, have a bit of discussion all together about this topic, which is really, really important and basically the core of our community. So first about me. As Alessandra said, I studied intelligent systems in Bielefeld, Germany. I also did a short postdoc there of 2.5 years. And I think I've met maybe a few who are here, have been to Bielefeld. It's a lovely town, so you need to visit it when you come along. I joined the University of Hertfordshire in 2017 to work with all the social robots we have that Alessandra pointed out are in Holthaus, and also the Casper robot, which is a robot that you use to investigate how children with autism interact with robots or can interact with robots. And I'm personally interested in the social robotics part of things. So how can we enable non-verbal communication between humans and robots? How can we facilitate trust and acceptability of robots and humans towards robots? Likewise, I also am interested in the core mechanics of robots, so how to integrate a system that really is working, can interact with people, and can integrate with the house environment, for example, in Holthaus. Yeah, as Alessandra said, Holthaus is a really unique facility where we research human and robot interaction, and it's unique because it's realistic and it's not inside a university on a campus. It is really in the community. We go outside and try to get the impression of people that are more or less at home to see how they react to a new technology like these robots there. And Casper is, like you can see here, for adults is maybe not the most appealing robot, but for children with autism, it's really helpful to overcome social isolation, help them to communicate, help them to learn language skills and these kind of things. And with these robots, with the Casper robot, we often go into schools, special needs schools, or language difficulty schools to research how that robot works there. Okay, in terms of reviewing, I am quite active in the reviewing, so I probably have reviewed a few of your papers. I'm certain I have reviewed 1 or 2 papers of your bosses already. And so I've at least have 40 journal article reviews and 40 conference article reviews under my belt, as you should have likely in the future too, because it's a process that's a volunteering process where we all can get together and exchange our views. Also, I don't have the reviewing experience, but I also have the experience from the other side, where you look at the reviews and have to interpret these reviews. So I look as a journal editor or board member and try to read those reviews, comprehend them, and try to formulate my final recommendation then from these reviews. Also, as well as Sandra mentioned, in some special issues we did together in program committees or in workshops, which is basically the same perspective as an editor. Yeah, and saying this, it's not only the things that you are directly related to. So, for example, I've reviewed in formal verification workshops or other workshops that are related to our field, but are not necessarily the core of our field. And it's not really necessary to be a core member of that field. You can do a review if you're slightly outside as well, because then you have a perspective for the average reader maybe that helps you to do the review in a little bit better form. Okay, so enough about myself. Let's talk about the process and how does it look like. So peer review is an essential mechanism that we have and use in our community. That is done by you, as I mentioned, and by everybody here, actually. And it's a mechanism to give feedback to the authors, basically. So that's one big aspect. You want to improve the article quality and the clarity of the article to have the authors write a better paper. It also encourages authors, because they know they are being peer reviewed by others in their field, to meet a high standard. They want to deliver something that is being seen as, I can see the chat here, sorry. Can I see that? Okay. Yeah, so that was on you. Okay. Yeah. I thought that was a question. No worries. You can ask questions, by the way. I know I have the chat open. I can reply to your questions.
I will read the chat for you.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, and not the least, what it does is this peer review process also enables us to network and build a community, because as an editor or somebody who is involved in asking reviewers to participate in a review, you really get to know a lot of people, because you get to ask them to do the reviews and they say yes or no. They tell you about what they can do, what they can't do, and you can really form good friendships and relationships using that process, actually. Also, it's not only a feedback mechanism for authors, it's also obviously a control mechanism to prevent certain things. So you don't want to have papers in your journals or conferences that have horrendous or invalid or unwarranted claims, right? So you want to filter these out. You also don't want things that have personal opinions or interpretations of things that are not generally accepted. That, I mean, obviously you want things that might be thought-provoking, but you don't want things that are not, founded in things that others can agree on. And there's nowadays in the area of GPT and these kind of algorithms, you have loads of bogus submissions and plagiarism problems that you obviously also want to filter out from publishing. Why do we peer review? Why do we not choose anything other? We do peer review because this is so far the only viable solution that we have. We don't have many other things that is equally good in terms of quality control, equally good in forming this community and getting things published. But having said that, it's also a process that's not optimal. We have many things that can be improved in peer review. So there are lots of criticisms that you can apply here. One would be that peer review, and maybe the most pressing thing is that peer review slows everything down a lot, especially when it comes to journal publications. Peer review sometimes delays the publication of findings up to 1-2 years. That's definitely what you don't want. So you need to find solutions there. Also, it can introduce biases. So you don't always have the optimal coverage of reviewers. So you tend to have a bias from that perspective from those people who put in their own reviews. So there might be an influence on authors that change their views, which is unwanted. Also, you have, especially nowadays, a reluctance to review. People like you, me, we have a lot of work, and our workload is not compensated in the peer review process. So we don't get any money for this. It's a voluntary process, and it often collides with our workload. So there's a certain reluctance to do a review. Also, some people don't really want to review because they lack the confidence to do that. I can only say you need to try and aim and get support from your colleagues, write a review, and have feedback about the review. Why not attend a seminar like this, learn how to do it, and then just try it out? It's often the case that in conferences or even in journals, you have one less experienced reviewer paired with somebody else who has more experience. And then you have two reviews from a different perspective, which is actually quite good if you're not that experienced. Sometimes reviewer that is less experienced writes a better review than the more experienced reviewer because they have more time, or they want to do a very, very thorough review. Another obvious criticism is that there are problematic reviews and you want to filter them out as much as possible. Some reviews are just surface level reviews that tell you, look, there's a grammar errors, there are other things that are like punctuation, spelling, these kind of mistakes. If you focus on these and don't focus on the content of the paper, this is not a good review and they're not helpful. Obviously, also you have reviews that offer unhelpful or bad advice, make a paper worse, which is not what you want. Totally unacceptable are things that are overly harsh, personally attacking. There are people in the community that sometimes suffer from things like racism, sexism, other things that are obviously inappropriate and should be avoided. So that's why there usually is something like an editorial review of the reviewer. So to avoid these reviews from being ever published to the author, but slips happen there, and these things obviously are problems in the review process itself. Another thing that people often criticize in peer review is that others read your work and they read your work before they're being published. So there is the potential of that your ideas, that your contributions are being stolen by somebody else and used for their own advantage. Also, not only reviewers are problematic, sometimes also authors are problematic, and that they might just ignore the reviews. Sometimes in conferences, especially if a paper is accepted, authors sometimes just ignore the reviews and publish the paper as is without taking that review into account. Okay, so having stated all these problems, let us look at the process of how the review process works. Everything starts with the initial submission. So you write an article, or somebody writes an article and they submit their paper to any venue, be it a conference or a journal. Then this paper is usually assigned to a so-called handling editor, who then gets this paper in a journal at least, that gets this paper and has a first look at it. What can happen there is it gets to a plain desk reject. Right? If the journal editor, the handling editor says this is out of scope, for example, or it doesn't meet the minimum requirements, this can be rejected without a review. So some papers you hand it in and you just get them back without anything. This can also happen at a conference, for example, if you are over the page limit, or if you don't follow the other requirements, like I don't know, formatting of the paper. If the paper is not rejected as a desk reject, it then goes into the review period, where then it's assigned to an editor or a program committee member. So an editor is usually the title of somebody in a journal who is handling the manuscript, and the program committee member is somebody in a conference doing the same job. So in the later stages, I will refer to an editor because for simplification only. This editor then finds expert reviewers for the paper, usually 2 or 3. Depending on what the venue promises. Sometimes they say 2 reviews, sometimes 3 reviews. I've seen little less and little more, actually. Then these external reviewers submit their review and their scores, which I explain later. And based on these scores and the reviews of these 2 to 3 reviewers, the editor or the program committee member writes a short meta review summarizing the reviews and then formulates a recommendation based on the review comments and the paper. So the meta reviewer sometimes has a look at the paper, sometimes doesn't really have a look at the paper, but only relies on the reviews to formulate their opinion. These reviews and the meta review are then returned to the authors. And at this stage, you either get your manuscript rejected, or if you don't get it rejected, the following happens. This rebuttal or revision period may start depending on a few factors. Sometimes a rebuttal period is part of a conference. Sometimes it just isn't. So after this first stage where it's rejected or accepted, you are done, right? You need to implement your changes in the manuscript and then you are either in the conference or not. But if you happen to have this rebuttal period, then this process starts. And this is usually the case in journals where you have a revision period when after you have a certain score of the manuscript, you are allowed to change things in there. So what you do is, as an author, you can submit your rebuttal or revision to address the reviewer concerns. These things are sometimes being handled interactive, so there might be a discussion phase between the authors and the reviewers, where then maybe an online platform is used to you have the comments listed there, and the authors can reply there, and then again the reviewers can reply to these comments. Sometimes it's not interactive; you just submit your rebuttal and your revision to address these concerns. Then also optional, highly optional actually, is a discussion between the reviewers and the editor about the rebuttal and revision. So reviewers have the possibility to react on these rebuttals and then tell them if this rebuttal has changed their opinion or not, or if that rebuttal has not changed their opinion or has not affected their outcome. And very rarely, for example, in the HRI conference, a second program community member is then assigned to that process and writes another general grant overview based on the original submission, the revised submission, the comments, and the discussion comments. And then in the end, in conferences, the program committee meets sometimes in person to discuss the papers and make a cutoff between what is accepted and what is rejected. And this process, especially in journals, is repeated until a final decision is being reached. Usually the rebuttal period in conferences, if it exists, only exists once, right? So there's no second iteration. But in journals, that can be up to 2 times, 3 times, depending on the amount of changes that are required. Okay, any questions so far about the process of review? You can pop them in the chat if you like. If not, I would just continue with my thoughts. Okay, so let's come to the best practices and guidelines, where I first want to introduce can you see that here? The components of the review. So usually, and that is quite common, that conferences and also journals require a very, very similar structure of a review, which is which gives the editors the power to judge a review and a paper. So you first start usually with a summary of a paper, where you summarize the approach of the paper's main findings, and what it contributes to the journal or the conference. After that, typically you list 2 or 3 strengths and weaknesses to give the main points of criticism or of strengths of the paper. After that, you have a part where you give a detailed feedback, and usually you go through the manuscript section by section to give feedback on each section individually and point out actionable items that the author can address and what the reviewer can then look into to see whether there's anything that prevents that from publishing or makes that publishable. And in the end, you formulate your recommended action to the editor so that the editor knows what to do with your review. You give them your opinion. What should you do with the paper if you were the editor? So you inform the editor of what would you like to do. In the end, it's not your decision; it's the decision of the editor. But you try to inform the editor to do that, and you empower them to have the strength and the knowledge to either accept or reject the paper. So in the end, don't be discouraged or disappointed if the editor's decision is not yours. It's just one of maybe 3 reviews that then inform the editor about the decision. Okay. Now, having said that these sections exist usually, let us go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So, in the summary of the paper, what you do is as I said, you list the approach, the main findings, and contribution. And for that, I just wanted to give you one good example, which I find, which I had as a review, is something like this, where you inform the editor about the content and the contribution of the paper. So you can say something like this: the paper's key findings is a novel approach where a robot learns a cooking task in interaction with humans. So you list what the paper is about, what the problem is. The presented method seems promising in general, but at the same time introduces unusual interaction patterns that limit the validity of the approach, right? So you point out good things and bad things, and what is the method sound, right? Also, the paper claims that the proposed method significantly improves teaching behavior, evaluating it in a user study. However, that study does not fully support this claim. So you see here already that you have an idea what the paper is about, what it tries to contribute to the community, and what it finds, and is it successful in doing so. So give your first impression is a really good thing to get the editor in the mood of, is it something that I want to accept or not? Also, what you do here is you summarize, and the message to the author says, did you understand the paper? Right? The author can then see that the reviewer, you, understood the paper or did not understand the paper. So then they know whether they had the correct line of argumentation or not. Then after that, what you do is you go ahead and make a bulleted list of major strengths and weaknesses. For example, something like this. One strength would be highly relevant problem and a promising solution that involves a human-robot feedback loop. So that's a really positive thing to say because it makes the paper relevant to the conference, right? This helps the editor to say, okay, look, this is really something that we might want to have in our conference. Another strength would be is a good comparison and analysis of findings and non-findings. So you see you have a paper that takes into account things that it didn't really find and states that honestly, and then at the other side also points out what it really found out, right? An example of a major weakness would be something like this, an incomprehensive evaluation that lacks testing against potential side effects. So the experimental design was flawed with regard to the participant background. Another thing which would be a major weakness of a manuscript would be it's an inconvenient presentation of the experimental procedure. So meaning that people cannot really understand how the experiment was set up. So in the end, this paper fails to convey the message of how they do the things, and it makes it difficult to repeat the experiment, right? So you basically, in this section, in this measures strength and weaknesses section, you give a summary of your later detailed comments, and you also give an outlook of what people have to expect. With regard to the author, this also again gives them the feedback that they have done things correctly and certain things need major improvement. So this is giving them something to improve in the next revision. So this is the thing that they need to focus on when writing the next revision if they get accepted. So the detailed feedback is the main part of the review. And in this, you need to pay attention to a few things. The most important thing is that you have to identify that the paper conveys some kind of message to the reader. Can you identify that message or can you not identify it? Is the paper successful in conveying that message to the potential reader? So look into things like, is the paper well written? Can you understand it? How much effort does it take you to understand the paper, to understand the sentences? Is it very technical? Is it very, does it have contain long sentences or short sentences? Put yourself into the shoes of a conference attendee that reads that paper, for example. Would you be able to understand it without much effort? Because the scientific content itself is difficult to grasp, right? So the writing style itself shouldn't be another burden on top of that. Look into what items would need more clarification. Do you understand that, or does somebody need more detail to understand a certain concept? Do you need to introduce things? Sometimes people in papers give references to some concepts, but they still need to repeat them to some degree so that the paper itself can be understood. So make sure that everything is consistent and nothing is lacking. Also make sure that the stated objective in the beginning is really what the paper is about. Sometimes people start to write a paper, and they diverge from the original objective, right? Can you follow that argumentation? Is everything in line with the first paragraph, the first few things in the introduction? Is it easy to follow, or does the authors do they jump around a lot between different concepts, between different things? Also check that there is sufficient evidence to support claims that authors provide. So very frequently in the introduction section of a paper, people write the most interesting things, right? But they are not backed up by evidence. So make sure that there is sufficient evidence to support any claims that are provided. Also, if information is provided, check that it's accurate and current and consistent. At the same time, some things need clarification, but other things are maybe too lengthy, right? Some authors don't come to the point and write about certain things that are not relevant to the main message of the paper. I had the case that I had to throw away half of the literature review because it was not relevant to the paper, right? And that's fair to say as a reviewer. Say, is it to the point of the paper, or does it maybe address something else that could be written about in a different paper, right? Does it contain appropriate amount of figures? Does it maybe contain too many figures, right? Sometimes you miss details, sometimes you have too many information. Also comment on the accessibility and quality of tables and figures and diagrams. Can people who may have color blindness read the figures? Can they see the tables? Is it too much information in a table? Is it too small? These kind of things you need to check for and see whether the paper does that correctly. If there's the case that all figures or all tables suffer from that same thing, you don't have to point it out at every location. You can just point it out for the first time and say, this is repeated across the manuscript, and just point that out. Also look into the paper structure. Does it follow a standard structure? If yes, okay, this is probably good. If no, why does it not do that? I mean, it may be appropriate to follow a different structure, but then it should be obvious why. When looking into these things, always use specific comments. Always give a page number, a line number maybe, or make a direct reference to a specific area. So figure 2 on page 3 is insufficient because the text on the figure is too small. Something like that. Okay, now this is the overview of the main part of the review is this. Now let's look into specific sections and what kind of affordances they have. So let's look into the abstract introduction section. What do we look out for as a reviewer? In the abstract, you need to look for consistency, accuracy, and relevance. So make sure that the abstract really reflects what the paper is about. Make sure that it refers to the correct sections and to the correct things in the paper. So say something about the introduction, say something about the methods, and say something about the outcomes of the paper. Is it accurate? Does it really reflect what is in there? Also, sometimes I see lots of abstracts where there's information in there that's not really relevant for an abstract. Again, like in the slide before, is the information on point or is it wordy? Right? You can often scratch 2 or 3 sentences from an abstract. Sometimes you just need a little bit more information in there. And likewise, the introduction. Check the introduction for a timely motivation. Is the problem really relevant to the community? Is it something that might have been solved in the past? Look for things like, is the stated problem really a problem to address, or is it maybe not that relevant? Does the introduction identify a problem? Does it really write down the problem and offer a proposed solution in the paper, or does it not do that? Also, is the introduction good into guiding the reader into the paper? Because the introduction is, as the name says, introducing the paper to the reader. So you need to write down as a writer what to expect in the paper. And as a reviewer, you can make sure of that because you have an outside perspective. You can see whether the introduction really reflects on the paper, on the remainder of the paper, because authors sometimes have things in their mind that people who are not really in the project don't really have in their mind. So they need to make it accessible to others, to readers in the field at least. So the introduction should state the methods being used. It should also provide a general summary of the findings, give a sneak preview of what you later find, right? Give something that the reader is conscious and interested about. Also, what kind of implication does that paper have for the community and relevance? So check whether the paper's introduction spells these things out, because then the paper is a good paper and can be interpreted by a reader easily. And also, what's good practice, check for a summary of the paper's reminder. See whether the introduction has something like a paragraph in the end that says, you will find this in section 2, you will find that in section 3, because that actually helps readers to access a paper. And excuse me. This also, as an author, is very good advice, I think, to try to put that in, even if you're restricted on space. Then let's look at the related work section and what to look out for there. So make sure that the references are timely. Again, it needs to be, if it's obsolete, the information then you shouldn't reference it. Maybe because of historic reasons, it is also good to have some older references. But if you talk about current methods, you should always make sure that there's nothing more new or other things that may have superseded the approach. Timeliness also means that if you have something like an established method that has been there for forever, try to find the one that first designed or defined this concept. Try the one, provide the reference that introduced the concept rather than the one that just is a spin-off of that. Right? So let's say you have the concept of theory of mind. Provide first person who thought about that project of that concept, right? So people know what you're talking about. Also see whether the preferred work is interpreted in the correct way. Sometimes people misuse references for their purposes and just include them because of the title. So really have a look. If you know the reference, it is good practice to see whether they put it in the correct context or not. If you don't know the reference, sometimes it really helps to look into that if it's not obvious what it says. Also, you need to check whether the coverage of references is sufficient. Do you know other work that might be relevant there? Provide pointers to that, right? Provide actual references in your review text to related literature if you feel that is missing. Sometimes this aspect is something that people, reviewers especially, misuse to put out their own work a lot, like disseminate their own things and only provide pointers to their own references, whether they are fitting the context or not. This is obviously bad practice, so please make sure to provide a balanced view, even though you might be familiar with lots of things in your own area. But the most important thing in the related work section is you need to make sure that the references are relevant for your paper and not just in general. Is it relevant for the stated problem and the solution that the paper that is presented offers, right? Do the authors use the reference in the remainder of the paper, right? Do they build on top of the cited or not, right? If they do, they need to argue why and how they do that, right? If they don't do that, just listing a reference for the sake of it's in the area is not helpful, right? Check the relevance of the references. Also, it might not be that the paper that people use that work, but they can also offer an alternative. So common things, the criteria for including related work is people use that work in the remainder of the paper, or people offer an alternative to that work in the remainder of the paper. If they don't, then most of the time the reference is not really necessary for the paper, and then it's distracting from the main content, and you can tell people that. At the same time, it is obviously also true that you don't have to do a literature review for the authors. You don't need to go and look through the whole field and find references for them. Tell them, look, this is something that you missed out. Maybe you look into this group of people and that institution that work on that problem. So maybe they can help you, you can find a reference there, but don't do a full literature review. You don't have to offer like 5-10 references if you feel there's something missing. Say this field of work is underrepresented or that field is overrepresented because it doesn't add anything. If you look into the methods and the evaluation and results, you need to check for things like the accuracy of the description. Are the methods described correctly? Is the evaluation done correctly? Are the results presented accurately? For example, if you have a statistical evaluation, is there are the correct numbers there, like the test results, not only the p-value, but maybe other things like a power analysis or things like that. But again, as in the previous sections, the most important thing is to look for the line of argumentation. Do the authors sufficiently guide the reader through the manuscript? Do they tell why they have chosen the methods to, or do they just tell you the methods they used? Right? There's a subtle difference in that. People can write about things like, yeah, we have used that HMM to answer that questions, but why did you use that? Is there an alternative there? If yes, why did you choose this one? If no, say this is the latest method that is available. If these bits of pieces there are there, then it's a good line of argumentation. If they're missing, it's not a good paper because everybody could just put things together and see what happens. There has to be a reasoning for it, and the most important bit is to describe that reasoning to the reader, because otherwise the paper doesn't really offer a lot. Right? The advantage that we have in research is that we can learn from the others why they show certain things and not that they show certain things. Right? And this needs to be conveyed in the methods and the evaluation and the results section. Also, how are the methods then appropriate to answer the research questions? Do you feel that there might be an alternative that is more powerful? Or do the authors argue that this is the best solution because of this and that? Or do they not argue that? Do they say we used an ANOVA because they used an ANOVA? Or do they say this is the standard method of evaluating this, so we chose an ANOVA, right? There's a subtle difference in the line of argumentation that you have to look out for as a reviewer. And always keep in mind how easy would you be able to replicate these experiments if you were somebody, like, for example, you yourself. Could you do the experiment also based on the description? So, or not only the experiment, if they describe a system or something like that, are you able to replicate what they write? If you're not, then there's obviously something missing in the description, and point that out. This is valid feedback for the authors to improve their paper. Also, always, especially in the methods section, especially in the results section, is there any alternative to present certain results? Some people prefer figures, some people prefer tables, but sometimes the mix is better, and you as a reviewer have the power to influence that, what you like, what you feel based on your experience is the best medium to present these kind of things, but often there's like a standard way of presenting things that then should be followed. So make sure this is the correct form of presentation of these methods. So again, in all of these comments, what you need to make sure is that you have tangible recommendations. For example, mention that this figure is too small. This method might be swapped out to a different method or things like that. Offer your comments on your view. And then let's look at the discussion and conclusion sections. Look for things like the connectedness between the discussion and the results. Is the discussion really rooted in the results, or is it something that goes away from that too far? Obviously, it needs to go away from just presenting the results, but also it needs to be in a tangible area, right? Is it really rooted in the results, or could it be explained by something else? Like, is there a disconnect between those two things or not? At the same time, the discussion brings the paper to another level in the sense that it takes the result and puts them into new context. So what it needs to do is also take into account new external evidence, contrast to other papers, look what others have found in maybe different areas. Is there something else that could explain the phenomenon that you saw, right? Also, again, have a look at the introduction, have a look at the problem statement. Is the contribution that was being presented in the beginning in the introduction consistent with the discussion and the conclusion now? So there needs to be a link between the conclusion and the discussion and the initial problem statement, right? Also, from a perspective of a conference organizer or an editor, how relevant is the contribution for the venue? Write that down. Write down, this is something that the paper states it contributes this. In fact, this is really valuable for the conference, and it really contributes what it pretends to contribute. And for the authors, again, this is also a feedback mechanism. You want to point out future directions that might benefit the authors as well. Write down, this is an interesting project that can be, applied to this particular thing or that particular thing as well. As a summary of the review, you then give a recommendation usually. And in journals and conferences, you have different scoring mechanisms. These differ widely between different journals and conferences, but these are the most common ones I wanted to list here. Journals usually go through a revision process. This is why they have things like accept, reject, or the amount of revisions required, right? So you can inform the editor about the amount of work that this manuscript needs in order to be published in that journal. If you feel like this is very minor revisions, minor changes only, then you can go for a minor revision. If you feel this is something that needs a complete redesign of the paper, then you tell the editor this needs a major revision, right? In a conference, this is very similar, but the wording is slightly different. You either say this is a reject or an accept, if you wanted to accept or reject it, and then you have subtle nuances of these ratings. So if you feel this is a really good paper, you can go for a strong accept. If you think it's an acceptable paper, you can say this is even a best paper candidate. And in all these, try to avoid neutral recommendations because that helps the editor a lot. If everybody went for a borderline or like revisions, we wouldn't know what to do as editors. And so your job is to inform the editor about what you feel the paper is. Only if you really are torn apart between two things, for example, if it's a really interesting paper, really of high value for the community, but it has some negatives in there that would prevent it from publishing, but you feel this can be done in time, then you can go for a borderline maybe. Okay, and then paired with this numerical evaluation, which there you can say this is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, etc., which you can usually have in conferences. You also give some summarizing comments. A few good examples of these comments that can support the editor to make a decision is, I believe that this paper makes a significant contribution to the conference and should be included in this year's technical program, which is a very, very positive thing. So this might be a strong or an accept. While the paper has some weaknesses, it could be included in the technical program as it makes the following contributions. And this is a weaker accept in that sense, maybe even a borderline paper, as mentioned before. Although the paper has some weaknesses, they can be addressed by making the following improvements and list the few things that you maybe had in the beginning as the major weaknesses. While the work presented in the paper is promising, it does not seem to be ready for publication due to major weaknesses in the structure, the presentation, and the evaluation, whatever you feel is the most pressing problem with that. Also, if you feel that the paper is really not a good paper, you can say things like the paper does not seem to be appropriate for the topics and the goal of the conference, and the authors should be encouraged to submit their work elsewhere, such as. So try to offer alternatives because, as I said multiple times now, this is also a feedback mechanism for the authors, even if they don't get accepted, right? So summarizing a few guidelines, what to do whilst preparing these things is you should definitely not do a few things, but you should pay attention to a few other things. One thing you should not do is you should not disproportionately criticize optional things and formalisms. For example, if a paper is 7 pages instead of 8 pages allowed limit, this might be appropriate, right? Even though don't say things that are formally optional as a criticism if it's not warranted. Also, you should not point out every grammar, spelling, or punctuation mistake because it's pointless to be an editor in that sense for that grammar. It's more what you want to do is you want to point out that there are grammar, spelling, or punctuation mistakes, but you don't want to point each and every one of them. You want to say this is a common problem. Please fix that. Also be very careful with wording because you don't want to discriminate against things like people that are non-native speakers, because some non-native speakers have a very good English, some don't, some native speakers don't. So don't say things like have this read by a native speaker because that's not the point. The point is there are mistakes that need to be addressed. Also, do not focus on criticizing the research idea or project because that is typically being done when reviewing research proposals. what you have here is a research paper, and that paper you should review based on how good a job it does to present the findings of the paper and not the research idea behind it. Obviously, if there's a flaw in the design, yes, you should criticize that, but don't criticize the project itself, because that's not the point, right? If it is not relevant to the community, okay, sure, you can go ahead and criticize that, but it's not the focus point of a review. Also, don't reject papers only because they have been, put on archive or a personal homepage or have been presented in a workshop before. But because this is exactly the point of having a late-breaking paper or workshop, to have, ideas about a paper, ideas about presented to a smaller community maybe, and then have it put forward to a conference or a journal for real publication. At the same time, you should still make sure that that paper presented to the conference or the journal has some novel ideas, or if the previously not published but openly made available work has some ideas, then make sure that they really address that idea and have something on top of what has been previously presented. Your review, as mentioned earlier, should definitely never have any personal attacks or opinions. It should address purely the content. And personally, what I do is I don't even use the word authors. What I say is this manuscript lacks, that is wrong in the presentation style, but never say the authors made the mistake here and there, because that quickly can devolve into a situation where there is the personal feelings being involved. But if you focus your criticism purely on the context and use words like the paper, the manuscript, the presentation, then it's much more neutral in that sense. And you can have a very, very third-person review instead of, addressing the authors. You can use the word author when you say the authors are encouraged to publish it elsewhere or, do this and that, but don't try to criticize the authors. Also, usually, not all of the time, but usually what you don't do is you do not include any identifying information about yourself, because the review process usually is at least single blind, so the authors don't know your identity and should not know your identity. Sometimes even you don't know the identity of the authors. On the contrary, what we should do is you should look into venue guidelines. So most of the conferences, most of the journals have certain guidelines that you can follow, and look into those. Provide a constructive and actionable suggestions, as mentioned earlier. Also, try to serve the author from a mentor perspective. Try to make their manuscript better. Try to take the author's perspective and see what kind of help could they use. Support all your criticism with justification, be it something that is good practice, be it something that you have seen somewhere else, that maybe, address color-blindness or something like that. Also, take into account who is the target audience of that paper. Is it the Roman conference where people from HRI, computer science are there, or is it some kind of other venue where maybe people with a more psychological background are and need to understand things differently? So always try to see whether the audience can understand what's written. When giving your final review suggestion, consider the time frame of publication. Is it too much to do in the time? If the review, the final deadline for a conference is within 2 weeks, consider whether it's possible to also put all in these changes that you require or not. And then make sure that your review is consistent with your recommendation. If you say this is a reject, use words that obviously make it obvious that this is a reject that you recommend. If this is a very good paper, make sure you point out that this is a good paper. Even though you point out criticism, minor criticism, make sure this is a minor issue. You can write things like, this is a minor issue, but should be addressed. Okay, thank you for your attention. That's all from me. I think we have time for a few questions. So many.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Yes, we still have some time. So if there are any questions, you can either raise your hand or write in the chat. So perhaps while people are, I can break the ice for, let's say so.
Yeah.
Patrick, what do you think? Because sometimes, in particularly, of course, in studies where they involve the human participants, where it's quite difficult to find the participant.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion about a small pool number? Because sometimes the reviewer are a bit too harsh if they have a small number of participants.
Yeah, I agree. It is a factor that you should consider. There's nothing that you usually should reject a manuscript just purely on that. Like you shouldn't go ahead and say this is a too low participation numbers. This is not acceptable. Given that the authors frame their findings in a correct way, so you need to make sure that the study is in line with the so the results presented are in line with the claims later on, right? If you have a low participant numbers, you can say this is a preliminary study, something that evaluates things from a first perspective, but we're not sure yet, then this seems to be acceptable. But if you say we found a huge difference between those two groups, whereas it's just 10 people per group, this is obviously something that's not matching, right? So this might then be a problem, but it's not a problem per se. It's only a problem if the authors then overclaim things.
Yes, Dimitri.
Yeah, that's a nice question because I have something a bit related to that. And thanks for the presentation, by the way, because at the moment I am reviewing and it can be a mess sometimes to decide. Yeah, what about online studies then? Because sometimes, and it's my case, for instance, to address the problems of reaching a sufficient number of participants, we can use online studies. And like in our field, human-robot interaction, people don't like them so much. So is it a region for rejection, or is it the same as Alessandra, for the same answer that you provided to Alessandra, that if it's not overclaimed, then it should be accepted?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, yes, it is very similar to what I replied to Alessandra. If people are in line with what they say, then it shouldn't be a problem. But as you rightfully pointed out, we are in human-robot interaction, right? And because of that, it might diminish the the contribution of value to our field, because we are interested usually in things that have an embodiment, right? And if you consider things like that, then likely there are differences between what you experience from a remote medium or in an interaction face to face. If the authors acknowledge that and discuss that, then you need to decide whether the contribution is still relevant enough for the conference venue or not, right? So it really depends. Maybe it is a thing of this paper is then in the pool of papers that are maybe qualitatively good technically, but given the I don't know, amount of submissions, fall off then, right? Something like that. So yeah, it's a bit of both.
Thanks.
I will ask, I will ask you to comment also on something else, because this is very relevant to either you are a reviewer or, as we have done, as guest editor, or for a conference of a special issue. I have encountered sometimes, both in the papers so that means from the point of view of the authors, but also reviewer, that pointed out to include in the paper either too many citation of the authors themselves, they added too many citation, or the reviewer is citing several of its own works. So what is your opinion about that? Should they suggest also some of their own works, of course, or
I think
it up?
So for the second question, I think it's fair to point out your own publications if they are really relevant. right? Why not? You are the expert in that field because you wrote that paper, right? So there's nothing bad in pointing out that this work has been done or has overlap, or there's something you might consider in your approach. You can obviously do that, but for obvious reasons, you just shouldn't put in, 5 of your own publications because you feel they could be similarly like somewhat related to the work, right? You need to be careful and not, drive an author to that. You can also say more general things like this group or these people have, discussed that phenomenon already. So maybe you look into their works, and then they can find out themselves, right? But provide some tangible, actions that they can use. Provide, maybe a link to the institution or the website or something like that. Then that's I think it's more than fair to do that. Then speaking about the editorial requirements of not having too many self-citations, that is something a bit more tricky, because this is nothing in the merit of the reviewer, but when the reviewer feels that these citations are appropriate because they are prior work or they are something that is related, because usually what you have is a paper that continues some kind of work that has been done by that group earlier, right? It's fair to have a few self-references in there. Why not? Conferences and journals do not like that, obviously, because then their self-citation impact factor diminishes, right? But that's not the job of the reviewer. The reviewer needs to look for the accurateness and the necessity of these references, right? And obviously, if it's both for the self-citations or other citations, there's like an excess of citations, then this is not good, and this you should point out, right?
So there is also another question from Dimitri. Is there a way maybe to point out one's work as a reviewer and point out the potential conflict of interest to editorial board of the sake of transparency?
Oh yeah, there's definitely that option in most cases. So you have a confidential comment to the editor field where you can declare any conflicts of interest. But that shouldn't stop you from, pointing out literature that is relevant in that field. You can also say, if that work has duplicated your work and they don't reference you, you can point that out. You can say, this has been done in that work already, and this seems to be highly rated with the same findings. It's not bad that somebody does the same experiment, right? But if they don't acknowledge that it's a follow-up or comparative work, then it's obviously a problem. So it depends on how you write it, but you can make clear to the editor that this seems to be plagiarism, right? Whereas you write to the author that they didn't point out that this was there, right? So you have two different kinds of information that you share. This is why there is an editor field that you feel, that where you can feel, when you can have confidential discussions with the editor.
So actually, I think I missed, probably was not, you didn't touch in the details about it. It's connected to Dimitri's question. Could you comment a bit more on the actually conflicts of interest before accepting a review? So which are the criteria for which we should consider ourselves biased and prevent us to review that paper?
This is a really tricky question, and it's being handled differently across different venues as well. For example, in HRI, you can, as an author, list institutions that you affiliate with and work with to help the filtering process. So you shouldn't review work, or you should list somebody who works with you in the institution as a potential conflict, because that's obviously a conflict there, because you want your own institution to be in a good light, basically, right? So there are definitely obvious conflicts that you should consider and you should not review. So when, for example, you're being asked to review your own work or review the work of a colleague that sits next to you, you shouldn't do that. You should just reject the review. But then there are degrees of how far away, how far do you want to do that? Do you not review things for people you have been previously affiliated with? I think it's a balancing act. If it's the same project topic that you have been working on together, I'd say don't do it because this is a conflict of interest. If you're friends with somebody, also try to stay away from that, right? Because you might favor that person. Yeah. Also, as said earlier, anything that has any personal tax or personal, also beneficial relations is not part of the review. So if you feel that there's something that you don't like a person for whatever reason, don't accept the review for that, right? Just stay away from that because that might create problems that you don't want to have. And that can influence the review process in terms of bias that I mentioned earlier, right?
Are there any further questions for Patrick? Feel free to mute yourself if you want, or you can write in the chat. Okay, I guess you covered everything and everything was super clear. So thank you so much, Patrick. We arrived to the end of this seminar. It was a very, very interesting. I hope all the PhD students and early stage researcher who attended today, but also the more experienced one, could relate and appreciate your talk. Definitely was very interesting for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And one thing I want to point out is this should only help you to write a review. This should also help you to write a paper because reviewers look at these things. And if you make sure that these things are addressed, this is very much overlapping. So I try to make these slides available maybe on my homepage. And if you have any questions, just you can reach me on my homepage, on my email, on Twitter, whatever. Be in touch.
Yes, thank you so much. And we will share the recordings on the Perseo website. And we hope to see you soon.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Take
Thank
care.
you again.
Have a great
Patrick.
weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.